Hi everybody, here we are again. This is Lex, and this is another episode of Azure on Air. We are here live at Integrate. This is the first day of the conference, and with me I have Andrew Wilson from Black Marble. Well, before we proceed with the actual topic of today's session, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you for having me. Absolutely. So yeah, I wanted to have a look at having a security-first mindset and what that necessarily means to us. We've moved into a realm where there's multiple facets to what we do from a day-to-day. I know we've got these different words now that used to be covered as part of ALM, but it's now you've got DevOps, FinOps, a whole range of different ones. But I think we can get so entrapped in now the idea of having serverless, and we're now moving into Azure, that it can be easy to forget those base fundamentals of, have I actually thought about security in this particular case? And at what point is it too late?
Yeah.
Did I get to it early enough?
Yeah, it's just so easy to forget, right? As an engineer, you really want to focus on the solution. Yeah. And of course, we all know that security is just so important, but it's just so easy to forget because it's a little bit boring, maybe.
Absolutely.
But that's a bad story for your customer, right? Yeah, no, we didn't do security because it's just boring. It was delaying the project. You don't really do it, right?
Absolutely. And, that's exactly the point. It's, did we consider it at the point of requirements? Did we go to the point of saying, you know what, we're going to delve into whatever the solution might be, but there's a lot of depth to these solutions. There's a lot of depth to the technologies that we choose. And go from a requirements point of view, we're not even trying to consider necessarily the technology, just more the fact of how we're trying to secure ourselves.
How we're going to do it. Yeah.
So it's taking it from step by step, finally getting to a point where we're going, you know what, I've got your requirements. Now, how does that map over?
Yeah. That's also what I want to know. It's kind of a non-functional requirement, right? Security. Do you really see it happen that your customers think about that kind of non-functional requirements?
They often think about it from a prospect of data, because data is personal to them. It's often their revenue point. You take that away from them, the business often falls apart. So it's that case of going, what's my residency? What's my classification over that data? How do I make sure that that's secure? How do I make sure that I'm not putting anyone at risk? Yeah. So there's often a lot of thought put into that side of it. Yeah. But then there's a lot of faith that's been put into the developers and those that actually going to put in the solution together to actually go, well, actually, that data that's going between systems and the like, how are you making sure that that's secure? And that's often not necessarily something that the client, not that they're not interested in it, it's just, again, that faith has been put on us.
Yeah, and even for customers, you can understand it's maybe pretty complex, right? I mean, you might say, we're doing it with some certificates, but they won't have a clue, right? So it's also a matter of properly being able to explain what you have done in, let's say it's human language.
Absolutely, and the less we have to manage on our behalf, as there's less human error. But then there's also understanding the separation of concerns. When I build my applications and, we're in a disparate solution with multiple applications, especially if you go into Azure and you've got a whole host in the toolbox, how do I lessen a blast radius? If something were to go wrong, if it were to go wrong, does that now give access to everything? Have I literally handed the keys over? Or have I actually thought about the fact that, a SaaS key was leaked? Does that compromise one aspect or everything?
Yeah.
There's a lot to think about in that particular regard.
Yeah. No, that's for sure. And from now and then, it just happens that you read in a newspaper or somewhere online that some company has been hacked because of bad security. So it is just very important. Only from a reputation aspect itself, of course.
Yeah, it can be destroyed.
And with all those microservices, security is not necessarily easier than before, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. Each service will have its own slight differences or implementation of the capabilities. And one of the things that I love, and as a colleague of mine instilled from me as a mentor as well from a very early point, was the 3 A's. If you think about nothing else about security, just think of your 3 A's, which was access, authorization, authentication. If you have those constantly in the back of your head, you can't go too far wrong. You know, I'm taking two different systems. Let's say we're not even thinking about virtual networks and just put it.
No.
It's a much larger topic, but you know, let me take two systems. I want to make sure that they connect together. Well, how am I differing that access? How much, you know, maybe I'm putting some IP restriction in there. Maybe I'm, you know, I'm passing a set header through to make sure that it's coming from the system I know it should be coming through.
Yeah.
You know, there's ways of trying to identify that access point. But then there's also things like, well, who am I? What's that service's identity, and where's that been? What providers that come from?
So it's the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. And then you go, well, fine. You know, it's come from that service. It's got an identity, but what should that identity be able to do with this given solution? You know, you take something like API management. If I give it access to all the APIs, is that right? You know, I should be able to say specifically what that has access to. Again, just lowering that blast radius. It's quite critical.
True. Yeah, it's just so easy to just give full-blown access, rewrite everything to a specific API or user, of course.
Yeah.
But that's not a very good practice.
No, and I think that's the point. You know, if we come forward with a security-first mindset, we're not just going along the lines of, well, it worked, so let's ship it. No. You know, let's try and instill a little bit of that DevOps practice in there and go, you know what, it worked. Let's factor in the other aspects. Hopefully we've thought about it prior to that point, but then let's roll it out in the way that it was intended so that we can roll it out again. We can say with confidence that, you know, we did think about these different aspects.
Yeah, so indeed, you're also talking about automation of deployments, using IAC infrastructure as a code, use Terraform, use
Bicep,
for example.
Yeah, Bicep is definitely my choice.
Your favorite?
Absolutely, and I started with ARM templates right in the early days of it all, and as soon as they showed me what Bicep was, my word, I wanted to jump over very quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's just trying to make sure that as much of it's automated in that regard. And I must say, you can do an awful lot. You know, just being able to orchestrate how those resources are linked together, setting up the managed identities between them, making use of. It does make life a lot simpler. And I must say, I'm also quite keen for the now graph capabilities that they've put into Bicep. Well, I think they're still in a bit of preview, but that again, in that security point of view, of actually being able to again orchestrate that I've now got an identity. Let's go and put the other core aspects in place rather than having to do sort of like a multiple stepped deployment, as it were.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense, right? And especially indeed because everything you bundle everything in a Bicep script. It just makes it easier, especially for purposes like security, to have everything together, right?
Yeah. I mean that also takes a step out of all of that development process and goes more into practice, right? So you got, let's say, using Azure DevOps in that particular regard. It's, you know, do people in your team have the relevant access to do what they need, but at the same time, removal of said access so that they can't meddle with aspects. You know, for instance, I'm trying to deploy to production. Should they be able to deploy with their identity, or am I using something like an identity I've set up that's specifically only deploying to production?
Exactly. Yeah.
I shouldn't be able to contribute in production. I can read it.
No, true. Indeed, yeah. Read access is fine, but that should be about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Customers say to you, that's fine, we'll give you contributed, please just say no.
No, let's not do it. No.
I'll watch my deployment, push it through to production. I'll make sure it's working and it's there, but
that's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
UAT, dev, fine.
Yeah, dev test, and that's about it. Yeah, acceptance and production. We leave that to others.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You have your administrators, and they will manage. That's fine. Yeah. So indeed, we're talking about Azure. So we have all kinds of different microservices. What kind of suggestions would you have for specific resource types? How you could secure those resources?
So I'm very much keen for the whole let's do this API first approach, and one of my big passions as part of all of that is API management. I love that service. It's awesome. But that's usually where my mind immediately starts going towards, we've got logic apps, we've got Azure functions, we've got all these services that go behind, but let's now start having REST triggers as part of these. I don't want to be giving those URLs out to customers or to, it's hard to manage and it just looks awful, But what I can then do is I can put that into something like API management. I can manage them. I can manage the versions thereof. Gives me that consolidated API endpoint. And I can then also start saying, well, who has access to these? I can spin up the developer portal. I can say which users, which groups can manage. And so that's immediately where my mind goes to. But then it's followed by, well, from a security point of view, how do I keep those access points secure? One of the things that I was pointing out that was quite interesting was you have the subscriptions, right? So if I call an API, I provide a subscription key that will allow a call in that particular regard to call that API. What was noted of is that actually passes through to the backend. They don't strip that out. And it was deemed at the point, well, should that matter? You're in control of those services, but what if you're not? Because you can front up other APIs that aren't yours, that you don't manage, and at which point you passing your subscription key outside. So it's that case of, well, actually, I need to be thinking about policies that are within API management to go, you know what, that header needs to be stripped. That's not appropriate for exiting past that point. If you don't know about it, you're doing it unintentionally. Other aspects of it is, let's say I did want to put in a logic app or a function. Sure, I can just literally copy and paste that URL, put it into the backend for that APIM instance, for my API operation, for instance. But it's got that SAS key on there. That's plain text. And again, it's trying to identify the appropriate aspects of each service to go, how can I best manage that, what I'm now classing as it should be secure. So then you start thinking about, well, okay, you said that's a backend, but then it still has that in. So I need to think about named values, because now I can at least say I can put that in Key Vault. So immediately, and this is why I reference back to the point of you need to be considering it from a requirements point, is if you haven't thought about it till the point of development, the effort of just taking that URL and putting it into APIM versus I now need to chunk it up through the different aspects of that service has now gone, let's say, times 3 in effort. So it has to be considered the whole way through, but then it also affects my testing.
Exactly.
I entered an interesting conversation where it was, well, I've got an Azure function, I've tied it in, I've abided by the 3 A's, I've stuck it into APIM, it's secure. How do I dev test it? The whole, I can just from my local machine point at that function app endpoint and it works, doesn't work anymore.
What does
because
it say?
Exactly. Well, now I have to go through APIM. Is that right? Is that wrong? Should I be creating loopholes in my 3 A's to get at the function? And so it's actually going, well, no, you are defining a set point of access. If anything, your test should be identifying that you can't get access to the Azure function. And then it does work through the various methods. But then you are reliant on your unit tests and your other methods of verifying the logic between. So although we've been given more tools in the toolbox, it has ever so slightly changed the way we develop, and we have to think about how it's orchestrated.
No, that's for sure. And just like you also said, making the solution secure, that's great, of course, but just to have that verification, that also impacts the effort for the testers. Test everything open, test everything closed. Otherwise, you want to measure those different behaviors, right? And,
absolutely.
Just to know, test with different identities, of course.
Yeah, and to that effect as well, just because it works in your machine, as that good saying says. Just because it works in your machine doesn't mean it's just going to work when it goes into the cloud. We go, well, it's taken away from me. It's a PaaS service. They manage that, right?
True.
But there are differences. I found out a few weeks ago that, for instance, an Azure function, the runtime for that, let's call it 4.x. In that particular regard, what's in Azure and what's running and hosting your Azure function in that particular case is actually a minor version higher than what you are running on your local development machine. And so it's, again, it's not quite the same. And your machine also is doing a lot behind the scenes for you that it might not be orchestrating doing the same when it goes into Azure. So again, it highlights that point of, if I don't have my DevOps backing me, if I'm not doing things through a CI/CD and I'm promoting my binaries and I'm going through good practice in that regard, I need to be in a position where I can deploy something to an environment and know it works. And whether that means, I deploy to dev and occasionally now and then just rip it all out and redeploy, because things change.
Things change. Yeah, it's just so easy to forget an attribute that has been changed or has been added. To add it to your script and that kind of
Even
stuff.
manually. I mean, especially on a development environment, if you're working not as a single person on the team, if you've got multiple people, it's too easy sometimes to go, I'll just click deploy it. I'll just add a setting. It'll be fine. And then it's like 3 months later, it's not deploying now because you've done it from scratch. And you go, that was that setting. It was that one thing.
Now I remember.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then you're live meanwhile, and
when it starts to matter.
Exactly. Yeah,
but that's why I'm really excited about the capabilities they're bringing closer to your development environments. It doesn't take away, and that's why I say it doesn't take away from the fact you do need to deploy it into Azure and make sure it works there. But being able to take a standard logic app, being able to actually see the designer view of your logic app without having to do that in a browser, for instance, being able to actually test play those connections again with not having to be connected to the cloud and such. It brings it closer to you, allows you to have a play without impacting others, especially when you start thinking about, well, if I do a deployment, is that going to wipe someone else's work?
Who knows?
Now there's a little bit of
who knows
communication and collaboration that needs to be enhanced.
Yeah. We'll get there, right? I mean, we've done it for decades now, so of course, everything is a little bit new, and just like you said, of course, the bigger your team gets, the more communication and cooperation will be required.
Important.
But you will get it sorted.
Absolutely.
So, what kind of security technologies are all there for all your different resources? You have RBAC, you have certificates, there are different sort of data in transit, data that's just sitting there in the backend.
Yeah, so the one that I'm really pushing for at the moment is trying to remove manual management, which does, again, it moves in line with your managed identity. In some cases, that might mean that, I might have to use user assigned, system assigned. For those listening, you've got your user assigned, which is the ones you actually having to put in place, but you can use that in multiple services, or you've got system assigned, which lives with the actual resource itself. And so it's a case of going, well, can I put those in place and tie my services together? Because then again, I'm specifying based on role and identity, not a key that I might have to roll over, or it might be visible and taken over, and then I have to figure out who was that. I can have a little bit of a reliance again on a little bit of, as you say, role-based access, which, to be fair, is a big push that we go for. So anything from let's say Key Vault. You got the access policies. We're trying to make sure that people are moving away from that and going towards role-based access. Again, it's that least privileged. It should only need what it absolutely needs and nothing more.
That's it.
It's a good place to be.
Contributor. That's about it. Normally owner will be required in running transactions. So that's.
I mean, even from a resource to resource, right? So let's say I've got my Azure function and I want to use managed identity. So actually, rather than providing a connection string to the underlying storage account, I'm going to use managed identity to say you have access to that. But contributors a bit hefty for that. It might be that it only needs certain rights to actually do its job. And it's trying to hone in on the correct roles that might be applicable for that identity. So again, when we start thinking about that blast radius, if someone were to gain access, especially when you start thinking of like a user-assigned identity, that's not tied or living with that resource. So if anyone got that, could they do harm? and how much harm could they do. So it's wider picture.
True. And also, it's a complete chain that needs to be protected, right? If you're accessing an API, well, you want to have the user identity, or even still then some service identity. But further back to the backend, you might want to use different privileges, different accounts, and so on. Mm-hmm. But still, at the end, for complete transaction, you want to be able to track everything end to end.
Yeah,
and that adds some complexity to governance and auditing. And
absolutely. And again, it does move into a slight different topic, but having observability of what your integration, for instance, is doing, and even across multiple other integrations, is key. And it's often why one of the points we usually say is, have app insights in there, have your single log analytics. Put it in there, have the correlations in place. So as you say, a user sends a request to API management that went to the various back-end services and the whole way through. But if then, let's say that was being hammered for whatever reason, let's say someone's just trying to obtain access the whole time, I'm going to start seeing spikes, but not just from one service. I can now track that the whole way through and go, actually, what were they trying to gain access to? Was it everything? Was it targeted? But then even removing the security aspect, just actually knowing from a day-to-day that things are working as it should. One of the misconceptions is API app insights is just debugging, right? I put that in, it tells me if there's an error. If there's no error, everyone's happy. But it's so much more than that. Just going down that observability point of view, going, I know those services are working, but I know they're also within acceptable bounds. I know that, perhaps I need to increase my limits. Maybe I need to reduce them. It just, all the questions that you want to think about in terms of a day-to-day running of that environment you can get at, but then even how do I hone my integration? What's taking too long? There's good questions.
True. We are reaching the end of the webinar, the podcast. I must say. Is there anything you would like to share with the audience? Maybe some nice experience or a best practice that you came across?
Yeah, the one that, again, it stuck with me and it's done me well for how many years. So I'll say it again: the 3 A's.
The 3 A's.
Keep those instilled in the back of your mind: access, authentication, authorization. If you're thinking about those three the whole way through, from requirements to the point of delivery, you're not going to go far wrong.
You can't go wrong. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Well, it was great to have you. Our audience. Good session, good insights. Just remember the 3 A's. And we hope to see you in the next episode of the Azure on Air. And thanks again.
Thank you.